Hey everyone, today we'll be ranking every killer in DBD from easiest to hardest to master. For this we're talking how easy it is to reach peak skill with the character, and how much you will need to learn and overcome to reach that point. We have 5 tiers, drop your thoughts below, and let's get into it. Very easy. Freddy is a very simple character. You're primarily relying on basic attacks with him, and a very simplistic map traversal tool. You get a nice bonus passive of the dream world, and overall he's not got too much to learn or master. Wraith is one of the simplest characters, and his only real element to learn is use of his cloaking mechanic. There are a few tricks to learn with it, and slightly more knowledge and time spent to learn his movement and things like that, but really nothing difficult. Legion I think are quite simple. They're a little higher up after they got buffed, but they're still largely just chase focused characters with their inbuilt slowdown. There are a few tricks to learn and some mastery with using frenzy required, but I think they are on the easier side of things. Easy. Doctor is a character who is fairly simple at a base level, but does have more complex elements with his timing and add-on variation. However, I still think comparatively to most other characters, he's still on the simpler end of mastery. Clown I do think is on the simpler end too. He has definite complexity and a level of mastery to his bottles and their movement, especially with certain throws and making the most of positioning and distance. However, I do think equally there's not too much to him aside this. You're mainly utilizing general killer skills when playing as Clown, which you'll need to learn on most other characters too. Ghostface is a relatively simple character whose main mechanic is his stalking and marking. This is all fairly simple to master I think, with it being more of a general game sense thing than anything else. It's largely about positioning I think, and getting your timing right. Some slightly different movement for him too, which maybe adds a little more for him to learn. Demogorgon does have a slightly broader kit than a lot of the others down here, however I do think it's still on the simpler side. Its shred attack is quite easy to master with it being strong and simplistic zoning and damaging tool. Its portals are also quite easy to learn with them being straightforward teleport points that can be placed across the map, used occasionally too for information. Trickster is a tough one to judge, but I do think he's on the lower end, especially with his more recent changes. Trickster does require some accuracy and resource management, and general chase and map knowledge, but not quite to the extent of his other ranged counterparts. In general, Trickster is a bit more forgiving I think, although weaker. Not easy to master, but not hard. Before we go any further though, I'd like to introduce you to today's sponsor, Star Trek Fleet Command. A thrilling MMO that will surely test your abilities as you battle throughout the vast Star Trek universe, collecting resources and upgrading your fleet's shields, weapons, and crew, with the possibility to find and recruit legendary, iconic characters and ships from Star Trek to assist you in your exploration of the universe and expansion of territory and fleet. There is a whole lot this game has to offer with new missions every month. You can put your strategic mind to work by forging and negotiating alliances and joining factions. You can battle, upgrade, build, and so much more. With so much to collect and customize, there's always something new and interesting to discover. This game is a lot of fun and very expansive with just how much you can do. I really enjoy the visual layout of the game, jumping from one place to another and battling various ships. So be sure to check out Star Trek Fleet Command, completely free with the link in the description or comments. You can also support the channel by getting your operations center to level 5. Enjoy. Sadako got quite a wide range of votes, but ultimately I think she's not too hard. It's a bit confusing to place her I think because she got a lot of changes since her release, but at her core she is still fairly simple. She isn't an overly complex character I don't think, and she doesn't have too much to learn really. Your main concerns are applying that pressure through Condemned and utilizing your TVs and teleports well to control the map. Myers I do tend to think is on the easier end of things. Whilst he does have a variety of playstyles and variation in add-ons, none are that hard to learn or master I think. His base stalk, although unique, is also quite straightforward, with it primarily coming down to effective movement and positioning. Definitely not easy, but he's still on the simpler side. Moderate. Knight gets a little underrated in difficulty I think, with there really being quite a bit of strategy and thought that goes into him if you're not just reducing his power to dropping a guard at a loop. He has definite complexity with his ability to pressure 2 places at once, learning the guard's cycles, and using each guard's abilities for the best advantage. Skull Merchant is a character that gets a little underrated in terms of mastery, I think. She's a lot more complex than people give her credit for, because lots of people are still in the mindset of her 3-gen days. Intelligent drone placement and learning how to effectively utilize your tracking and drones to damage survivors is something that will take time. Merchant is a challenging character, and I do think gets oversimplified largely due to her reputation. Nemesis I would personally place lower, but I was convinced by all of you that he deserves a slightly higher spot here. His tentacle to me is quite simple and easy, with his mastery really coming down to this mainly. His zombies are sort of a non-factor, but I suppose you could say mastery of managing RNG or something. Learning the tentacle's movement, distance, and where it can get hits are all crucial though, and definitely provide a challenge. Bubba I think ends up slightly tougher than most think, because to master him you really have to master a lot of the maps too, because he's so reliant on being able to maneuver each and its respective tiles due to his sensitive collision. You want to largely be avoiding those tantrums at all costs, seamlessly weaving through loops and making the most of your insta-down. It's definitely on the simpler side compared to someone like Blight, but there's definite mastery there. Dredge is a character with definite complexity and one of the most unique sets of abilities in the game. Basically everything Dredge has performs uniquely to most other characters. This means there is little in the way of transferable ability or skill for the most part. However, I don't think any ability is especially hard to master either. It's more a case of having a greater initial setback and a number of things to learn at once. Chucky is a character who, much like many of the other Dash characters, has a lot of complexity and mastery come in the form of utilizing his movement well, and sometimes in ways that stretch how it was intended. It's not quite as dynamic or frequently changing as someone like Blight, but it's definitely a bit more similar. Chucky pairs stealth and a lethal dash attack, and these two things do take definite care and time to master. Plague is a character who does have a tougher mastery I think too, with her requiring utilization and mastery of quite a unique projectile with her vomit. The way it can move or flop and drop down is just not really present anywhere else in the game. She's further got to master the in-game play, the times in game when you need to make quick decisions on the fly, deciding when to take your red vomit and when to infect. I think a lot of Plague is like that. It's on the fly decision making where her mastery is going to show. Vecna is quite deceiving I think, with his many abilities in his kit initially seeming intimidating. However, I do think his actual abilities are quite simple, even when paired together. It is early days though, and so mastering him is not quite possible yet. I think it's probably impossible. This is very much guesswork at this point, largely just based on his initial difficulty and how effective he currently performs. For me, that's around the high end of this tier, I think. Hard. Xenomorph is a character whose main ability to learn will be the tail attack, being able to curve and dip it properly to make the most of the potential of its attacks. Xeno also just has a pretty loaded kit. I guess knowing how to efficiently move through the tunnels and when, knowing how to properly deal with flame turrets and their effective distances and whatnot, are all things too that will add to mastering it. Movement of the tail I think is likely the biggest obstacle in mastery here though. Pig's mastery seems to largely come in the form of timings and understanding the reverse bear traps and how they work with their timers, and how various add-ons can affect them. There are of course things like the ambush attack too, which is quite a unique attack and does have utility beyond being a literal ambush as it's described. Pig has complexity for sure, and mastery will surely be a challenge. Twins are definitely on the tougher side of the mastery, due to having two distinct characters, each with their own playstyle. Learning each well and then being able to pair them together for the best efficiency is something that surely takes a lot of time. Looking at Victor more specifically too, and there are a bunch of things to learn like his long distance leaps. Pyramid Head has a whole lot to handle and therefore quite a bit to master, especially as most of it does have some level of complexity and difficulty. Correct and effective usage of the trails and ranged attack, and knowing when to cage or hook. I think the majority of his mastery however is likely in his ranged attack, just due to its possibilities and potential with how it can go through walls and damage survivors in quite a unique way. Wesker is a simple character to learn at base, but mastery is a whole other deal with his various slides and techs. Many of these have been lost over time, but more will inevitably rise. Therefore I would place Wesker into this tier, although he could reasonably fluctuate depending on the currently available techs he has going for him. His movement is quite unique, and he has a number of mechanics to get a hold of. Oni is a tough one to judge, and last time around I placed him quite low down, but I do think he is a bit harder than I originally gave him credit for, and a lot of you seem to think the same. Oni needs to combine effective basic gameplay alongside efficiency with your activated power. Being able to get that initial blood, but then continue the constant snowball needed for him is a definite challenge, and is so wildly different from game to game. More than other killers, you need to be able to assess the skill of those you're chasing. Oni also has a bunch of different flicks and tricks to learn, which add to the mastery also. Nurse is a hotly debated one. Some say she's super easy and others say she's very hard. I think she is hard just purely for her completely different gameplay to everyone else. It really is just a different game entirely when you're playing her. Learning the various and different ways survivors will attempt to counter you is a challenge, I think. She can be mistaken for being easy to master due to being so strong. However, I do think seeing the difference between a good and a great nurse does outline clear differences. Spirit is definitely a tough one to master due to her being so reliant on learning survivor movement and even applying this from game to game to specific survivors and their movement. Being able to predict plays as well as just gather the correct information from sounds is definitely not easy to master. There is a clear difference between a good spirit and a masterful spirit. There is a lot of awareness required to progress with her. Hag is a character I think is on the definite higher end of mastery. She's a character who needs to strategically set up a web of traps that ideally evolve and move about with the action of the game, or alternately have the action move toward them. Hag to me is a definite challenge despite her decent strength. She has a lot of add-ons that greatly alter her kit, and there's many moments in Trial where your power can quickly be wiped off the board and you need to keep your cool and pressure. Deathsinger is a character whose complexity comes in the form of his spear gun. Mastering him is definitely quite difficult with the many different shots you can do with it, weaving it through various objects. I've seen some crazy stuff done with Slinger, and I cannot say that I'm able to do the same. Mastery looks different on a character like this. This is what all your time will go to though for the most part, and therefore I don't think he quite makes the top tier. Huntress is really a character with sort of endless potential due to her hatchets just being so dynamic. A character who really does embody complexity within simplicity. Mastering her I think is no easy task at all, having to learn pretty much every map's collision and all the various shot and snipe spots across them. That's really where the majority of her mastery is going to be. A tough task for sure. Unknown is a character who has not been out long to really understand the true potential of. However, I do think it's high, and I do think it's likely yet to be reached. There is a lot to learn with Unknown and its various shots and angles you need to consider when using its power. The UVX is very unique in its movement and ability to bounce and damage through walls, which really opens up the possibilities. Billy I think has dropped a bit since his rework, as he's now quite a bit stronger and able to make a lot more maneuvers that were before a lot trickier and harder to master. He's still tough though to reach that true mastery I think. He has so many loops to learn, so many different curves and angles to try and achieve from map to map. Stronger nowadays, but still a definite challenge to master. Very hard. Trapper is a character who ends up in the very high tiers despite his simplicity, because he just has so much to learn and master due to his traps and the many maps the game has. Not only this, but he's another character who really needs to react to the moment and the actions in game. A nurse can hop in and doesn't need to worry about much, but Trapper needs to be very conscious of where the survivors are, where he wants to move them, and stuff like that. There's a lot to master with Trapper, and a lot working against you as you do. Artist is a character that I think gets underrated quite a bit, but I think just for the sheer potential of her power and the possibility to damage from almost any point on the map really does make her land in this tier. A character who may also be yet to be truly mastered by anyone just due to how much potential there is with her crows and their ability to gather information and damage, but then further your ability as a player to act on these things and utilize them effectively. Pinhead is a very unique character with a lot of complex elements and things to learn and master. One of the harder ones I think is his chain shot. It's a unique moving projectile with quite a specific set of uses. Knowing how to use it and when to use it I do think is tough. This on top of the ability to predict box spawns and actively pressure during a chain hunt is really critical I think. A character who is not only clearly tough but hard to master too. Blight, much like Wesker, is one of those ever evolving characters, which is part of what makes him so hard to master I think. There's always a new tech, there's always a new thing to learn on Blight. He requires a deep and precise understanding of maps and tiles, more so than most other characters. He also requires a good understanding of the collision and distances and things like that. Blight is a strong character, but he is undeniably a very hard one to master as well. Again, a Blight player can do well with good knowledge, but seeing a masterful blade is a whole other deal. Singularity I'm going to make a case for being the hardest to master, and I think this is because of just how much variation in playstyle you can have with hooks, and the equal difficulty of these playstyles. If you want to be more chase focused, or set up areas and hold one down almost like a trap character, if you utilize information and play more stealthily, these are all viable I think, and in some way you sort of have to play all of these at some point in a trial, and vary them from match to match. He's a character I would debate has no definitive way to play him. The mastery comes I think in combining all these elements, which I think is incredibly difficult. He's a difficult character as is, but I think that potential and the endlessness of learning his pod placements, movement, and incredibly unique kit places him in our top spot. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and be sure to put your own rankings down below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.